Hello everypony, welcome back. This is going to be continuing my reading of Shut the Blinds. So here we go. Chapter 3. Blame. After leaving Fleshlight's cottage, Twilight made her way down into Ponyville, where things seemed as normal as they had ever been. The village was happy, and in turn, that made her happy. Still, the dark cloud jeering Rainbow Dash is blind hung over her head. Even with the early hour of the day, the small town was bustling with activity. Many of the residents were already outside, going about their business. But they stopped and politely waved a hoof in greetings to Twilight when they saw her, which she returned in the same manner. As she walked through the quaint streets, she tried to keep her mind off Rainbow Dash and Fluttershy. How awkward was that conversation? It was almost like they were two strangers trying way too hard to make small talk. Twilight shuddered, shaking her head and wishing that life had a rewind button and an erase button. All she wanted to do was banish the thoughts clouding her conscience to a very far away place. Like the moon, for instance. Or maybe she wanted to lock them in a dungeon. Maybe lock them in the dungeon to the place she banished them to? That sounded good. She tried to keep herself occupied with less burdening thoughts. How were her other friends doing? When did the books in the library have to be restocked? Did she have an assignment from Princess Celestia that were due? Twilight gulped. She sure hoped not. Speaking of the princess, did she know about Rainbow Dash's current condition? Surely the Alicorn had heard something about it, Twilight figured. Still, the unicorn decided she might as well send a letter anyway, just in case the teacher wasn't uninformed. It wasn't long before the welcoming sight of her own home was in front of her, and not a moment too soon. She smiled, eager to flop down on her bed and take a nap. Lighting up her horn, she swung the door open and stepped inside. "Twilight!" she heard Spike's voice exclaim eagerly. The baby dragon ran excitedly up to her and slammed into her side, scooping her up into an embrace. Twilight, while happy to see her #1 assistant, wished that he would stop hugging her so tightly. "Spike!" she gasped. "Not so tight." "Oh, sorry," he apologized sheepishly. He let go of Twilight and took a step back, giving her space. "It's just that you haven't been home very often this week, since... Yes, and I'm sorry about that. It's just, I've been so worried about her." Twilight sighed. "Wait, is Rainbow Dash okay?" he asked quickly, his eyes widening up in concern. Twilight gave him a reassuring smile. "Yes, she's fine," she said. "I hope," she added on silently. Spike let out a breath of relief, wiping his hand over his forehead. "That's good. You had me worried for a second there, Twilight," he said, chuckling. Twilight rolled her eyes and made her way up to the bedroom, wanting more than ever to take a nap. She had been up almost all night at the hospital, waiting for Rainbow Dash to wake up, or for something to happen, as she had been most of the week. Come to think of it, she estimated that she hadn't had more than 5 hours of sleep through the whole terrifying week Rainbow Dash had been fighting for her life. Eager to get some rest, she made her way up the stairs to her bedroom. "Oh, Twilight," Spike called up to her. The unicorn turned back to the dragon and looked at him with tired eyes. It seemed every pony wanted to stop her from sleeping today. "Yes, Spike?" she asked impatiently. "The new shipment of Daring Do came in yesterday, and I was just wondering where you wanted me to put them," Spike told her. He seemed to understand her impatience, though as he spoke quickly and without hesitation. Twilight thought for a moment. That series would go with the other copies, of course. It did give her an idea, though. Maybe she would take one of the new books to scratch that thought. It seemed Rainbow Dash's lack of sight was going to take more time to adjust to than she had anticipated. Just put it with the other copies, she instructed. A thought then occurred. Oh, and can you order a copy of Daring Do and the Sapphire Stone in Braille, or at least some form of the book you can listen to, Twilight requested. Spike gave her a questioning look, but then gradually softened. He nodded brightly. Sure thing, Twilight, he agreed, finally turning away. He walked up to a small table in the center of the room and picked up a scroll from one of the table's drawers. The dragon unrolled it once, and it was on the flat surface. Spike picked up a large quill from the ink pot and rested on the far corner of the desk and put the tip to the top of the scroll and began writing her instructions down. Twilight nodded quietly to herself and quickly trotted upstairs to her room, not wanting to have any more unwanted distractions. When she stepped in, she immediately shut the door behind her. Without any hesitation, she flopped ungracefully onto her bed and closed her eyes, ready to shut out the world. Mercifully, a dream state of unconsciousness rushed up to her. When she awoke, she found herself on her back with her legs spread eagled out on either side of her body. She blinked once, not sure how her body had ended up this way. Even then, and despite her uncomfortable position, she felt more well-rested than she had felt in a while. She found that her mind was much less foggy than it had been before she had fallen asleep, and it was easier to put thoughts together and process them. She rolled over and hopped down from her bed. Luckily, her legs didn't buckle underneath her when she hit the ground. She stretched where she stood, speeding up the process of getting blood flowing back through her limbs. The unicorn shook her head and yawned, making a small squeak sound as she did so. Since she didn't have a clock in her room, she glanced out the window and saw the sun was high up in the sky. It's nearly noon, if it isn't already past that, she said to herself. A small panicky feeling prickled in the base of her stomach. Had Rarity already come by and she missed it? Hopefully that wasn't the case. Taking a few steps forward, she reached a small drawer where she stored some extra scrolls. Taking a random one in her magic, she unrolled the scroll and took a quill that was in an ink pot on her desk, with her magic as well. She decided that it would be best if she didn't dictate this particular letter to Spike. Twilight felt a certain responsibility towards the subject. She was the pony who brought Rainbow Dash back from the dead, but she had also blinded her, after all. This knowledge weighed down upon her shoulders heavily, but it was a choice between Rainbow Dash being gone forever and her being blind for life. For the unicorn, the choice was crystal clear. However, she put herself in the Pegasus' horseshoes. It might have as well been death for her. Taking a deep breath, she put the quill to the paper and started writing. After a long while of productivity, she was finally pleased with the results of her letter to the princess. She rolled it up neatly and sealed it, putting the quill back in its resting place. She held the scroll in her magic and made her way downstairs to the main floor of the library. To her surprise, a female voice greeted her as soon as she came down the stairs. "Twilight, there you are," Rarity said, trotting up to her and giving her an affectionate hug. Oh, hello, Rarity, she answered, looking from her fellow unicorn to Spike, who simply shrugged his shoulders. Oh, darling, it's so nice to see you awake, Rarity smiled, releasing Twilight from her grasp and flashing a ladylike smile. Wait, you knew I was sleeping? Twilight asked incredulously. She felt very self-conscious all of a sudden. A better question would be, who didn't? You were snoring so loud, half of Canterlot could probably heard you. Spike's. A better question would be, who didn't? You were snoring so loud that half of Canterlot could probably hear you. Spike's mouth was suddenly transformed into a large zipper and was promptly closed, courtesy of Twilight. I think we've heard quite enough, Spike, Twilight said, chuckling nervously. Without warning, she pushed the letter she was holding into Spike's chest. He jumped and clutched it tightly against him. With one hand, he unzipped his mouth and gave the unicorn a very unamused look. I need you to send that to Princess Lestia right away, she instructed. The dragon grumbled something Twilight couldn't make out under his breath, but did what Twilight requested of him. He took a deep breath and the scroll burned away in a bright green flame. Could you actually hear me? Twilight asked Rarity, her ears flicking back against her head in embarrassment. Well, would it make you feel better if I said no? Rarity asked, chuckling sheepishly. Twilight felt a brilliant heat rise to her cheeks. In fear of learning something else embarrassing she did in her sleep, she quickly changed the subject. Can we see Rainbow Dash now? She asked. Rarity blinked once in surprise. Yes, of course. That's why I came here, she stated in a matter-of-fact tone. Twilight nodded. Of course, she thought to herself, mentally slapping her hoof to her forehead. Not wanting to waste any more time, she headed to the door and stopped once she got there, turning her head back to at Rarity. Are we going? Twilight asked, opening the door and walking out. Rarity rolled her eyes in a good-natured fashion and quickly trotted after her friend. However, she looked quickly back inside the library. Goodbye, Spiky Wikey. Thank you for the tea, she called to the dragon. He returned and the wave more excitedly than he would care to admit. No problem, Rarity, he answered, smiling from ear to ear. The dragon turned away from the door for a few moments, but something he had stored in the recesses of his mind popped back up. Not wanting to forget again, he turned around. Hey, Rarity, His exclamation was stopped when he saw that the object of his affection was nowhere in sight. He sighed dejectedly and closed the door in defeat. A few yards away from the library, Rarity and Twilight were making their way down to Ponyville Hospital. Did you talk to Fluttershy, Twilight? Rarity asked. Twilight stayed silent, in her mind scrambling for an appropriate response. Twilight, the unicorn echoed, raising an eyebrow. Yes, I did talk to her, Twilight answered slowly. Well, how was it? Rarity inquired impatiently. It was awkward. That was the only word that came to her mind to describe the situation that had taken place. Awkward? Rarity replied, wanting to know the details of the past conversation. How so? The seamstress noticed Twilight's steps seemed to become heavier, like she had the weight of the entire world resting upon her shoulders. It was then that they stopped altogether. Rarity halted beside her. It was almost like she became shyer than she was before. Twilight sighed. Rarity, she blames herself for what happened to Rainbow Dash. Rarity smiled, compassion crossing her graceful face. Twilight, look at me, she told her. Twilight reluctantly did so. In the time I've had the pleasure of knowing Fluttershy, I can assure you that she's much stronger than she seems. She'll get through this. She just needs some friendly reassurance, Rarity promised her friend. She didn't doubt her words, not in the slightest. She just hoped that her shy friend would be able to pull through this hard time. That she was skeptic about, however, but Twilight didn't need to know that. Perhaps, Rarity scrunched up her face in thought. Then she brightened up. Perhaps I'll invite her to the spa tomorrow. Yes, that would be lovely. Besides, I'm in need of a good hoof a cure, she said, bringing her right front hoof to her face and studying it carefully. Twilight looked at her friend, considering what the other unicorn had said carefully. It seemed that Rarity was right. Twilight easily overlooked it sometimes, but Fluttershy was indeed a strong pony, given the right support. However, she still felt that it was going to take a long while before any real progress was going to be made. I think that's a great idea, Rarity. It'll be good for her to know that her friends are there for her, and we don't blame her for this, Twilight said, nodding her approval. Because we all know who the title belongs to. They started walking again and made very light conversation the rest of the way, and it seemed the mood had brightened significantly, compared to when they had left the library. But that chipper state of mind came to a grinding halt when they finally reached the hospital. The large building stood there, proud as ever, in front of them. It cast an imposing shadow that made the two unicorns cringe slightly. Twilight had never really liked hospitals. Her mind slowly wandered to a time long before she came back to Ponyville, when she was still in Canterlot. She had to visit Canterlot Memorial Hospital when her brother had broken a limb when he was in training to become a Royal Guard. The place was full of suffering ponies and reeked of gauze and antiseptic. As a filly, she had always felt sympathetic for the ponies housed there, but never wanted to be in there herself. Granted, she didn't believe any pony wanted to be in there. After her brother had recovered, she had urged him time and time again to be more careful so he wouldn't, and more importantly, she wouldn't, have to go back there again. Luckily, Shining Armor had listened to his little sister's pleas, and Twilight was saved from any more hospital visits. Are you all right, dear? Twilight, Are you quite all right, dear? Rarity asked, looking at Twilight with concern. Twilight caught herself in an instant. Of course, never better. What gave you that idea? She laughed nervously, plastering on a clearly fake smile. You've gotten about 2 shades paler, and you're positively shaking in your horseshoes. That ought to be a good indicator, Rarity answered, raising a brow. Lavender Unicorn had been so caught up with how much she hated the building that she hadn't noticed how her inner thoughts affected her appearance. She shook her head to clear her head of those thoughts and smiled sheepishly. I'm sorry. I don't like hospitals very much, she explained. It's quite all right, darling. I'm not much of a fan either, Rarity answered, winking. With this shared bit of information, Twilight felt more at ease. It was nice to have some pony who shared the same views as you sometimes. A bit more reluctantly than she would have liked, she and Rarity walked up to the hospital's double doors, and opened them, quickly stepping inside. The inside looked the same as when they had left, except with more ponies that were seated in the waiting room. Twilight had seen most of them walking around the town, but didn't know them personally. Some were ponies she had never hadn't. Seated in the desk was Nurse Redheart. When the double doors had produced a clicking sound when the unicorns opened them, a aforementioned nurse glanced up and smiled when she saw the two familiar ponies enter. The two walked up to the desk, eager to get on with seeing their friend. "You girls are here to see Miss Dash, is that correct?" Nurse Redheart asked, sitting up a bit straighter in her chair. Twilight rolled her eyes internally. Why else would they be there? "Yes," they both answered. The nurse looked to her left and then to her right before she got up out of her chair. She walked around the desk and stood before the two unicorns. "Come with me," Redheart said, starting to walk down a long, narrow hallway. Twilight and Rarity followed anxiously. They both knew where their friend's room was, but if they were being led by Nurse Redheart herself, something must have happened. Still, they kept quiet, hoping that some clarity would be given to the situation present. It didn't take too long to get to the room, but once they got there, they were stopped by Redheart from entering. They shared a look as the nurse began speaking. "I assume that you both remember Miss Dash's little episode from this morning," she asked. Two nods proved that her assumption was correct. "Well, after you all left, she demanded that we leave the room. We complied, and she's been quiet since. Rarity told them. "Yes, and?" Twilight asked impatiently. She bobbed her head up to try and see over Redheart's shoulder, wanting to see if there was a way she could get past the nurse. "And I'm just warning you that if she asks you to leave, it's probably best that you do," the nurse instructed. Twilight nodded. Although she didn't quite agree with it, she understood the suggestion. Rainbow had lost almost everything dear to her. It would be idle that she wanted to have some time to grieve. Hopefully that period of time wouldn't be too long, but she didn't hold her breath for that. As she looked at Rarity, she saw the look of defiance and doubt that crossed her features. It was very subtle, but it still showed. The nurse must have noticed this as well. "Mind you, it is just a suggestion," she said. "Take as long as you need to." With that, she took her leave. Rarity snorted and rolled her eyes, but Twilight responded with a sharp look. The white unicorn turned her eyes meaningfully to the nurse that continued walking down the hallway, but Twilight was having none of it. "She's right. We have to let Dash have her time to grieve," Twilight told her friend. "Of course," Rarity sighed, begrudgingly in compliance. Twilight's voice softened. "And we can't let her know about Fluttershy. Not right now, at least," she instructed, reaching out a hoof to open the door. Rarity nodded and stepped back. Twilight took this as the signal to open the door. Taking a deep breath, she pushed her hoof against the flat surface. The small creaking sound it produced as she opened it slowly made her wince for an instant, but she paid no attention to it. Instead, she focused her mind on what the room before her held. Without any further hesitation, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. So that was chapter 3, and I will probably make another reading later on this weekend, so be up for that. Have a great day, every pony. So be prepared for that.